There has been more false information spread by the press the last 10 years than in 100 years before that. Who would you guess said that? And when do you think they said it? That's John Adams in 1798, complaining about fake news. Adams was an important figure in the American Revolution, but as president, he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, outlawing false and scandalous statements about the federal government and used it to target his political opponents. The conversation about fake news and misinformation can sometimes make it seem like it's a new problem, because that's how people like to justify rolling back our civil liberties. Sure, free speech was great 100 years ago, but now we have this unprecedented problem we have to deal with. But the problem of misinformation isn't unprecedented. It's been with us at least since the invention of the printing press in the 1400s. Almost from the moment the printing press was invented, people were outraged by all the information and ideas that people were able to easily spread now, including false ones. The printing press revolutionized people's ability to communicate with each other and spread ideas. The Dutch Renaissance scholar Erasmus said printing presses fill the world with pamphlets and books, foolish, ignorant, malignant, libelous, mad, impious, and subversive. Of course, they also filled the world with a lot of truthful ideas that overturned established dogmas. And European governments reacted with brutal suppression of dissenting and unpopular ideas, establishing censorship boards to pre-approve all publications, throwing people in jail, burning people at the stake. But gradually our ancestors came to realize that the ability of people to speak freely is vital to our search for truth and knowledge and the foundation of democratic self-government. And whatever the cost of free speech is in terms of allowing people to spread false or hateful ideas, the cost of empowering the government to decide what can and cannot be said is much higher. Governments have and will abuse that authority to suppress much more than the ideas you think are dangerous. We see it happening today in countries around the world. Governments suppressing speech to consolidate their own power. They never let a good crisis go to waste. During the COVID pandemic, many countries passed broad and vaguely worded misinformation laws that they then used to crack down on journalists and activists that oppose the government. Whether it's the radio, TV, or the internet and social media, each time a technology comes along that changes how we communicate with each other, it generates fear, panic, and calls for government control over the information environment. So keep that in mind when you hear arguments today that the problem of fake news or misinformation somehow justifies rolling back our most fundamental, hard-fought freedoms. Minimizing the spread of misinformation and hate is, of course, a legitimate objective in general. But as a colleague of mine recently said, you can't censor your way to truth. And you also can't censor your way to a hate-free society. So let me take a few minutes to explain what the First Amendment does and doesn't protect in this context. Generally speaking, the First Amendment protects all speech unless it falls into one of the specific, narrowly defined categories established by the Supreme Court. Examples of unprotected speech are true threats of violence and speech that incites, is intended to and likely to incite people to immediately engage in unlawful action. But the First Amendment doesn't make a general exception for false speech. Xavier Alvarez was a member of the board of directors of a water district in Southern California. He was also a habitual liar. He lied that he played hockey for the Detroit Red Wings, and he falsely claimed that he was once married to a Mexican actress. But it was another lie that got him in big trouble. In 2007, at a public meeting, Alvarez said he received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military award for valor. he said he was wounded in action as a Marine. Turns out none of that was true. The government prosecuted Alvarez under the Stolen Valor Act, which then President Bush had signed into law the year before, and which made it a federal crime for anyone to falsely claim they're awarded any military decoration or honor. Alvarez appealed his case all the way up to the Supreme Court, which held that it violated the First Amendment, that the law violated the First Amendment. The court rejected the argument that the First Amendment doesn't make it, that the First Amendment doesn't protect false statements. Some false statements, like fraud and defamation, are punishable, but the falsity of a statement alone doesn't bring it outside the protection of the First Amendment. Take fraud, for example. Fraud isn't punishable just because you said something false, but because you told a lie in order to obtain money or some other material benefit. If Alvarez had lied about his Medal of Honor for the purpose of material gain, that would be a different story. And in fact, the law was later amended to add that type of requirement. But the Stolen Valor Act applied to false statements made at any time, at any place, by any person for any reason. A conversation in a private home, lying on a dating app, maybe some people think that should be unconstitutional. But let's not lose sight of the principles at play. Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote in the case that if our interest in truthful discourse alone were enough to justify a ban on speech, it would give the government a broad censorial power that would have a massive chilling effect on free speech. He said the remedy for speech that is false is speech that is true. Justice Breyer observed that some lies might even serve useful purposes. They may prevent embarrassment, protect privacy, shield a person from prejudice, or provide the sick with comfort. They might stop a panic or otherwise preserve calm in the face of danger. Right? Like many of our parents lied to us about Santa Claus. And on top of all that, we'd have to trust the government to exercise this power to punish false speech fairly. I think lies by government supporters would get the same scrutiny as those by government critics. Early in the pandemic, many countries, including Cambodia, Malaysia, Palestine, arrested activists, government critics, allegedly spreading misinformation. Imagine how a misinformation law would play out in our current political environment. All of the claims coming from all. In a free democracy, those are things that should be worked out, debate, and through the democratic process, not by allowing one side to use speech restrictions to tilt the debate in its favor. It's not always easy to separate truth from fiction. Our knowledge on many issues is less than perfect, constantly evolving, distributed sometimes across many individuals and institutions. Yesterday's misinformation becomes today's truth. We've seen that with COVID. CDC changed its guidelines on masks. The theory that the virus originated in a lab in China was initially dismissed as wild conjecture. Now many scientists believe it at least deserves consideration. And the line between statements of fact and statements of opinion can also be blurred. If you say that COVID isn't that serious, or if you say it's the worst thing that's happened in the last 20 years, could that be considered misinformation? Are you trying to state a fact, or are you just expressing an opinion that other people are free to agree or disagree? Of course, it's not just COVID. You can point to any number of other issues on which the consensus has shifted or there's disagreement about the truth, especially health questions. Are low carb diets good for you? Is saturated fat bad? Could you stretch before or after a workout, or both, or neither? In the 1940s, Camel ran an ad showing a doctor leaning back at his desk smoking a cigarette with the caption, "More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette." I think we now know that smoking is not. So by allowing the government to place an issue beyond debate, we lose the chance to correct errors in our thinking and to come to a better understanding. There's even talk now about so-called malinformation. That's information that is
based on fact, but used out of context, mislead, harm, or manipulate. So even true information now is kind of falling under purview. That's the definition according to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security. It also has the word security in its name. Do I even have to explain how disastrous regulating malinformation would be? And if you want the government to police misinformation, you also have to grapple with the fact that the government itself has a history of spreading false information. In the 1970s, the Pentagon Papers revealed that the government was intensifying its war effort in Vietnam without the public's knowledge. More recently, evidence has come out that high-ranking officials have thought for years that the war in Afghanistan was unwinnable, but they hid that view from the public. For many years, the government overstated the dangers of marijuana, even claiming it leads to murder, rape, and insanity. So if you want the government to police information and even potentially throw people in jail for it, that things are going to get messy. In my experience defending free speech, I would say the other type of speech that generates the most calls for some type of regulation is so-called hate speech, or speech that someone finds offensive. But under the First Amendment, the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea just because others find it offensive. People say hate speech inspires violence or intolerance against members of certain groups, or they may argue that the speech itself inflicts a sort of injury on its targets. So what's the issue with regulating? Well, here's just 3 examples of people punished for hate speech. College student handing out stickers critical of the Chinese government, man tearing up a Quran, and pro-Palestinian activists wearing t-shirts calling for a boycott of Israel. Basic problem with regulating hate speech is that hate and offensiveness are vague and subjective concepts. One person's hate speech is another person's political advocacy. So it's very easy for authorities to manipulate these definitions to target speech that they don't like, or that's critical. If I'm a supporter of Israel, I might think your call for a boycott of Israel is Semitic hate speech. I'm a pro-Palestinian activist. I think that the Israeli government is oppressing the Palestinian people, and I might think that any expression of support for the Israeli government, there goes the whole debate. Just like with misinformation, the government uses this immense power to punish hateful speech, target their critics, activists, and other unpopular speakers, including members of minority groups. You might think, well, aren't hate speech protections intended to protect minority groups? That might be the intent of some people who support them, but in the end, it's the majority that decides how it's going to define hate speech. That puts minority viewpoints at risk of suppression. Even well-intentioned hate speech rules often have perverse results. Many Black Facebook users have complained that their discussions about racism on the platform have been removed under Facebook's hate speech policy. The reality is those in the minority need freedom of speech more than anyone else. Majority isn't shutting itself up. Just imagine if the government had had authority to punish hate speech in the 1960s. Former Congressman and civil rights activist John Lewis said, without freedom of speech and the right to dissent, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. And that's true of any movement for equal rights. If you think the majority is oppressive, why would you trust its representatives to define hate speech and regulate speech under that rationale? There's also just no evidence that hate speech laws are actually effective at reducing hate. In fact, there's evidence that racist and anti-Semitic attitudes have actually increased in European countries that have passed hate speech laws. How could that happen? Well, when you ban speech, don't make the sentiment behind it go away. It may actually further radicalize the speaker. Or you turn them into free speech martyrs. See, they say, government doesn't want you to know the truth. Censorship is itself extremely divisive, drives people apart, intensifies political polarization. You can't censor your way to a hate-free society. So to come back to this question of what's the government's role in enabling free and responsible speech, I'd say the best thing the government can do is just stay out of it. Just stay out of it, government. You're only going to make it worse. But they're not staying out of it, especially when it comes to speech on social media. Lawmakers and government officials are increasingly calling for regulation, especially to combat nation and hate speech on social media. Meanwhile, the Twitter files, which if you haven't heard of, are a series of internal Twitter documents that have shown how Twitter moderated content on the platform before Elon Musk took over, have disclosed extensive evidence of the FBI and other government agencies leaning on Twitter to take down disfavored speech. This is, when you look at some of the examples, it's actually laughable. One user with 6 followers tweeted on election day, "Americans, vote today. Democrats, you vote Wednesday the 9th." If you read that tweet and thought, "Oh, okay, I vote Wednesday," then you probably need to get your head checked. Maybe you shouldn't be voting. This is why transparency is so important. Social media companies should make public communications they receive from the government suggesting the removal of speech. They should make those requests public so that we can have confidence that the government isn't trying to violate our First Amendment rights behind closed doors. But what about when Twitter makes these kinds of decisions on its own, not under government pressure? I mentioned earlier that the First Amendment only applies to government action. That means Twitter, Facebook, and other private actors are free to restrict speech how they want. And in fact, they even have their own First Amendment right to decide what kind of speech they want to have on their platform. But just because social media companies can assume the role of speech police doesn't mean they should. Any of our conversations about politics, current events, and our culture take place on social media, on just a handful of social media platforms. Not only is Twitter a place to talk about the news, but the news is often talking about what's happening on Twitter. So for better or worse, these platforms do have the power to shape public conversation about important issues. We've talked about why it's bad for the government to regulate speech using vague and easily manipulated standards. Well, it's bad when Twitter, Facebook, or TikTok do that too. And these companies haven't shown that they're any better at doing it than the government. Their distinctions between heated political rhetoric, hate speech aren't any less subjective and arbitrary, any less based on the personal preferences of whoever happens to be in charge at a given moment. I don't want to equate the two. I don't want to equate government action with action by a private platform. Because Twitter can stop you from saying something on Twitter, but not anywhere else. Government can stop you from expressing a certain idea anywhere for all time. And it can throw you in jail if you do. The social media companies obviously don't have that level of power. And again, unlike the government, they're private actors and they have their own First Amendment right to editorial judgment. But they do act as central authorities over their own influential realms. And because they provide large, very popular forums for speech on public issues, you could absolutely care about how free and open the discourse is on these platforms. This isn't a legal argument, it's a cultural or normative argument. It's about how the actions of these powerful private platforms contribute to or detract from a culture of free expression. So how well do social media companies do content moderation? Short answer is badly. They make lots of unforced errors. Wael Abbas is an Egyptian journalist known for documenting police brutality and other human rights abuses. He's had his account suspended by both Twitter and YouTube. Last fall, Iran's morality police arrested a woman not wearing her headscarf properly. Within hours, she slipped into a coma, raising suspicion that the police had beat her while she was in custody. She wouldn't recover. The event sparked new protests in the country which the Iranian government has violently suppressed, and they're still ongoing to this day. Well, Facebook got in on the action too. It deleted a post that protested the Iranian government using a Persian slogan that literally translates to "Death to Khamenei," who's Iran's political and religious leader. But in context, the slogan is often used as rhetoric, just meaning down Khamenei. Is that hate speech, or is it political protest of an oppressive regime? Jay Bhattacharya is a health policy professor at Stanford. He was one of the most prominent skeptics of COVID lockdowns. In late 2020, he argued lockdowns were causing psychological and physical harm, and that only vulnerable populations like the elderly and the immunocompromised should be encouraged to stay quarantined. Twitter blacklisted him, secretly limiting the reach of his account. And this again shows, right, the blurry line between statements of fact and opinion. After all, Bhattacharya, he wasn't saying like COVID is a hoax, not real. He was simply saying he thought the lockdowns were a bad policy response. And here's an interesting one. After the 2020 election, Sidney Powell, a member of Donald Trump's legal team, said they were going to release evidence of fraud that would overturn the election results in several key states. Not long after that, the phrase "release the Kraken" began trending on Twitter. So Twitter censored the term Kraken as part of its efforts to clamp down on election-related. But it turns out that Kraken is also the name of a cryptocurrency app. It's also an NHL expansion team. And it's also a mythical Scandinavian sea monster. So you end up, in these cases, a lot of times restricting a lot more speech than you actually intended to. Twitter also restricted tweets of the hashtag #StopTheSteal. It's another favorite phrase of people who are protesting the election. But many of the tweets that reference "Stop the Steal" were actually criticizing it and were attempting to debunk claims that the election was stolen. So Twitter was suppressing speech and counter-speech on an important issue of public interest. Twitter's policies leave something to be desired too. You can see sometimes how they start with broad rules and then they start making all these exceptions because they realize that they're suppressing too much speech. A good example of this is Twitter has a ban on hoping that somebody dies, which might seem like a reasonable enough policy, although we already ran into a potential complication with the "down with" or "death to Khamenei" example. But the rule says we recognize that conversations regarding certain individuals credibly accused of severe violence may prompt outrage and associated wishes of harm. So in those cases, Twitter won't take the tweet down. So Twitter will decide in its sole discretion whether a person has been credibly accused of violence. And if so, then you can hope that they're thrown down a well. So how should social media platforms approach content moderation? I think ideally they would look to the First Amendment as a guide. Our body of First Amendment law reflects decades of accumulated wisdom about where to draw the line between protected and unprotected speech. Viewpoint neutrality is a central principle of the First Amendment. Above all, platforms should get rid of policies that single out specific political or ideological views for censorship. Of course, some speech would still be banned, just like under the First Amendment. So you would still ban threats of physical violence, incitement, child porn, definitely. Harassment, harassment properly defined would not be protected. So ideally, you would have platforms create just these narrow, well-defined, clearly defined categories of prohibited speech. And that would make content moderations more fair and consistent and not just based on the whims of Elon Musk or other tech CEOs. And platforms should also operate with due process and transparency. So it should be, you should know as a user have a good idea of what speech is and isn't allowed. And the burden should be on Twitter or whatever platform to explain to you, why it wants to take down your post. And you should also, so you have an opportunity to respond to that, explain why it shouldn't be taken down, or an opportunity to appeal the decision. often you don't get that kind of the process with these companies. So no viewpoint discrimination, clear, precise, consistently enforced rules, and due process and transparency. And let users control their own experience, right? So you can already block and mute people on most of these platforms. And they can probably offer more ways for users to filter their own content, control what you're seeing. So instead of a rule, say, banning all nudity, you let people opt out of seeing content that contains nudity. Now, I actually don't love this approach because it also increases the risk that people are just going to get stuck in their own information bubbles, surrounded only by like-minded people, which I don't think helps with polarization that's happening in this country. But it's at least preferable to the platforms deciding for everyone else what content they can and cannot see. So I've talked a lot about social media because it's a topic that dominates the modern free speech debate. But when we talk about a culture of free expression, I think it's also important to look at what other private companies and institutions are doing. Last year, PayPal suspended the account of an organization that defends free speech. Not FIRE, fortunately, but it was a London-based organization called the Free Speech Union. Why did they suspend the account? It has something to do with, quote, protecting the ideals of tolerance, diversity, and respect. Generally, when PayPal shuts down your account, they don't really give you a reason other than violated our terms of service. It's almost like a prosecutor charging you with breaking the law. This sort of financial censorship is a serious problem. I don't think we want online payment processors or banks or credit card companies screening people for their political views, because that has the potential to have a huge chilling effect on what people are willing to say. When you start hitting them in their pocketbooks, that's going to spell trouble. Just think about content creators, websites, online businesses that rely on online payment systems just to stay afloat, political candidates and nonprofits that rely on them to raise money, and of course, just like all of us, everyone who uses them to pay for things online. Send your friend a Venmo payment. These services are staples of modern life. I also just wrote about, this is kind of more on the creative or artistic expression side, but I just wrote about 2 comic book creators whose crowdfunding campaigns were canceled because of the content of their comic books. One of them, Mike Barron, has a pretty impressive resume. He used to write for The Punisher, he wrote for Batman. But he wanted to self-publish a new comic book called Private American, which tells the story of a Cuban-American ex-Green Beret who seeks vigilante justice against drug traffickers, human traffickers, and other criminals at the southern border. You can see how this would be like controversial, right? Any issues involving, or any way like potentially related to the immigration or involving the U.S.-Mexico border. And so he started the crowdfunding campaigns on Indiegogo, Kickstarter, and the platform crowdfunding. And then someone wrote an article in the online newspaper, the Daily Coast, that called Private American, which hadn't been published yet, by the way, but called Private American racist, and called on readers to contact Kickstarter to express their displeasure about this crowdfunding campaign. The very next day, Kickstarter canceled the campaign, which it had previously reviewed and approved, denied Barron the money he had already raised, gave him no opportunity to appeal the decision. Crowdfunder quickly did the same thing. So this is a good example of what people are talking about when they use the phrase cancel culture. Some people push back against that term. They say it discourages criticism, which is part of free speech, and that's true. But I want to quote the writer Jonathan Rauch, who offers a way to distinguish those two things, cancellation and criticism. He says, criticism marshals evidence and argument in a rational effort to persuade. Canceling, by contrast, seeks to organize, manipulate the social or media environment in order to isolate, deplatform, or intimidate ideological opponents. It's about shaping the information battlefield, not seeking truth. and its intent, or at least its predictable outcome, towards conformity. So the most important idea I want to leave you with is that censorship is simply not the answer to the problems, fake news, misinformation, hate speech, or other speech that we think has the potential to cause harm. It's a blunt tool that's inevitably abused. You end up suppressing a lot more speech than you intended, and you may make the problems you're trying to solve even worse. Responding to speech, opposing its message, or trying to change the narrative, best weapon you have against speech that you don't like. After all, the moment you grant that speech, that spreads hate, has the power to spread hate, or that false information, right, can influence other people's behavior, you've accepted the power of speech in general. That power runs both ways. But speech also has the power to persuade people not to accept bad ideas. Education is important too. So I think we should teach media literacy to get people in the habit of asking questions and approaching information you see online with curiosity and reasoned skepticism. When you read something online, right, ask yourself, who wrote this and what are their biases? Are they backing up their arguments with evidence, or are they just appealing to emotion? Do they stick to the issues involved, or are they engaging in ad hominem arguments or character assassination? Everyone should read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's basically like a catalog of all these cognitive biases that we all have. Distort our thinking and can lead us to wrong conclusions. Confirmation bias is one that you often hear about. Tendency to search for and accept only the evidence that confirms your existing beliefs while ignoring all contrary evidence. The availability bias is another example. Something bad can have a very statistically small chance of happening, but if the media reports on it a lot and you hear about it a lot, you tend to overestimate the likelihood of happening or the danger that it presents. If people were better informed about these biases and consciously kept them in mind when read stuff online, might have a lot less nonsense floating around. But one point I can't stress enough here is that these efforts need to be ideologically neutral. So not about just discrediting sources that you disagree with politically. It's about making everyone, on all sides of the political spectrum, better media consumers. Because no matter our politics, we all have an interest in being better aware of our own bias, skillfully navigating the ocean of it. Bottom line is censorship isn't going to solve any of these problems. It's not going to change people's attitudes or beliefs, alleviate their biases, or restore their confidence in government or in our institutions. There's a reason it took humanity so long to realize that free speech is a good idea. It doesn't come naturally to us. Trying to shut people up you don't like does come naturally. My boss, Fire CEO Greg Lukianoff, calls free speech the eternally radical idea because it has a proven track record of promoting human flourishing, yet it has to be fought for anew in every single generation. We all have to learn to resist that impulse to censor. Recognize that free speech is essential to democratic government, social progress, scientific discovery, a vibrant culture of arts and entertainment, and our ability to know what our fellow citizens actually think and believe. Greg calls that an underrated part of free speech. It's useful to know what other people actually think, especially if they have harmful beliefs. So I'm not suggesting that free speech alone will solve all our problems, but it provides a necessary framework to navigate and find solutions to problems that plague us. As the Supreme Court said, these principles do not vary when a new and different medium for communication appears. The internet and social media have actually been around for a very short time in the grand scheme of history. This is still all very new. And, I think there's sure to be a lot of innovation and disruption in the coming years. And we'll learn, to live with these technologies. But calling for censorship of what you think are bad or harmful ideas, that's an easy way to look like you're doing something to rid the world of bad ideas. It's the most obvious lever to pull. Even John Adams did it. But it's a non-solution. Doesn't persuade anyone to change their beliefs, furthers division, threatens to disable the greatest engine of human progress the world has ever known. Can't censor your way to truth. Can't censor your way to an inclusive, hate-free society. When you do hear speech or ideas that you don't like, use your own voice to put better ideas out into the world. Thank you. Hopefully you guys have questions, so I'll be happy to try and answer.
Just the they don't like block.
Yeah, so I think again, the First Amendment has a lot of wisdom to offer us on this question. So if I was designing the policies, I think I wouldn't have just kind of a vague prohibition on hate speech or offensive speech, because as I described, I think that gives too much discretion to the platform to ban speech in an arbitrary way, right, in an unpredictable way, and to potentially just target certain political. But I think the way to do it is, having a policy that Twitter isn't going to target speech for removal just based on the viewpoint expressed, but it still can have policies that address other conduct, like, for instance, harassing conduct, right? So, if you're persistently messaging somebody against their wishes, for instance, right, and sending them a lot of hateful information, and you won't stop bothering this person, maybe that at some point rises to the level of harassment, the platform can take action. But I think it's also important, right, that people, that the platform, and it does have tools that enable people to block and ignore other users. So if they think someone's engaging, right, then they can insulate themselves from that, not have to be exposed to it. Twitter should also ban, I think, threats. So if there's hate speech, that hate speech can threat of violence, or if it incites people to immediately engage in violence. That should be a high bar, because if you make the bar too low, start just pressing kind of heated political opinions on the left and the right. So I think the key is just to have very targeted bans on that type of conduct, but have a policy that doesn't allow the platform to just remove content based on the view.
How do you propose that protect our free speech when the people that have the ability that we need to talk to about protecting our free speech, like the government or social media, are also the people that can block our content or throw us in jail? So how do you propose that we try to protect or go about protecting our free speech?
Well, when it comes to the government, the most important thing is to just keep a robust First Amendment. As much talk as there is, and including from me during my speech, about worrying signs about a culture of free expression in this country, people's attitudes towards free speech. Fortunately, we do still have a very strong First Amendment the way that the courts have interpreted the First Amendment over the last 100 years is very speech protective, which means that, you know, if the government does try to censor your speech based on viewpoint, when it gets to court, like the court's likely going to find, is certainly going to find, if it's based on viewpoint, that the government violated the First Amendment. So that's our best protection against governments, is to make sure that those First Amendment protections aren't weakened. Of course, that doesn't protect you though, right, against like Twitter or private platforms. So there, like the answer is much more difficult. But I think, you know, a lot of it is like keeping pressure on the platforms, because they do sometimes respond to like what pressure they're getting from the public. So I think it's important for organizations like FIRE and other civil society organizations to keep up that pressure and to try and persuade these platforms not to have these types of policies that are overly censorial. And I think, you know, ideally, like everyone in this room and other people, individuals out there, would do the same thing and push back against it. Keeping pressure on the platforms like that is, I think, you know, a key way to try and change the direction. But, you know, there's also other ideas out there. I mean, there's this one idea. So there's this concept called interoperability. So one of the reasons that social media in particular is such a problem is that you only have a small number of platforms that dominate the space, right? So it's actually, the free market isn't operating so great in this context because of something called network effects, which means that the value of a platform is in part dependent on how many people are using it. So put that in like more layman's terms, like you're on Facebook or you're on TikTok or whatever platform, right? Because all your friends are on there and like you can connect with them. Maybe TikTok's not a great example because I guess that's so much based. It's not like Facebook in the sense that you have like friends. I don't know. I'm not on TikTok, but you get the idea, right? Like people are on Twitter because all the people, the journalists, the celebrities, comedians, or whoever they like are on there. So they're not just gonna like, even if another platform has better content moderation policies, they're probably, that might be not enough to like get them to leave that platform and go to the other one, because then like I have to leave all these connections I've made behind. Now that problem could potentially solve with this idea of interoperability, which means that platforms communicate with each other. They share information with each other, so you don't have to be on Facebook to like share information with people on Facebook. So a good analogy is like email. Like you might have a Gmail account, but you can still send and receive emails to your uncle who has an AOL account, right? So the idea is whatever platform you use, and then people can choose their own platforms they like based on whether they agree with the content, the way that platform does content moderation, but still have the ability to have these connections with people on other platforms. And that would be great, I think, potentially. It's at least an idea that FIRE is evaluating, because it could potentially be a good solution to free speech and a good solution to the dominance of just a few centralized platforms making the decisions for everyone about what speech is. Thanks for the question. Yeah. Well, if I'm being honest to my position, right? If I'm being honest to my position, which is that if all you're doing is expressing an opinion, I don't think that should be grounds for censorship. Personally, probably not many people in this room agree, right, with what Kanye was saying. I mean, yeah, I happen to be Jewish. Sure, especially Jewish people are not particularly enthralled with the comments, right? But I just don't think even in a case like that, the answer is censorship. The problem is, you know, once you allow that, I think it truly is a slippery slope. Once you start like you open the door to view, because that is viewpoint discrimination, whatever else you want to call it, right? He wasn't, to my knowledge, like Kanye wasn't calling for violence against anybody, right? He wasn't making physical threats of harm. If he had done anything like that, I'd say totally, like, he should be kicked off. But he was just kind of like saying crazy shit, right? Like that's basically what he was doing. So once you kick open the door to regulating on that basis, I just think it's only so long before okay, it starts with speech like that maybe most people can agree is bad, but before you know it, it's a lot more speech. Going back to like, my example of a lot of people think it's anti-Semitic to support the Israeli government because they think the Israeli government is engaged in apartheid against Palestinians, right? People call that hate speech. They think it should be censored. That's like one of the biggest actually issues on campus, and it has been forever, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, I think the best thing to do is just, Kanye, right? Like, I talked about counter speech. There was so much counter speech, right, in response to what Kanye was doing. Was there, like, all across the media, people on the platforms everywhere were condemning him left and right, and I think that's good. Like, that's what should be done. That's the answer, and that's the way that you kind of like try to stop the spread of those beliefs. I don't think censorship. That everyone. Did censorship accomplish anything in that case? Did anyone not know what Kanye believed? No, but yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Right. In other words, like, should the standard change if you have a big following? You're kind of an influential person. Yeah, I don't think that should change the outcome. If you make that the standard, then like, what about politicians? What about, do we start censoring politicians? And like another, and actually, I thought where you were going with this was Donald Trump, because people ask about that a lot too, like kicking Donald Trump off Twitter. That I think is potentially a closer question, actually, um, yeah, I don't think you can. It's dangerous to make the standard based on how influential a person is, because we don't want, in some sense, it's like actually the argument cuts the other way, because if they're influential, it's actually pretty important to know what they think and to be able to push back against it, especially when it comes to lawmakers and our representatives, right? That's how the democratic process works. We can't start muzzling politicians, and it's pretty important to know what the people representing us actually think, right? And to be able to push back against that. So yeah, I would say that wouldn't change my opinion of what the outcome.
So, what can we as students do to protect free speech on our campus and in our community?
Good question. I would say, I don't know if you have any. Actually, I should have asked you this, Noel, earlier, but I don't know if Northwood has like a kind of a free speech group, a student organization, or like, Fire actually like partners with students on campus. So that's an option right there. Is like, get in touch with Fire, and we have a lot of resources that can help students in advocating for free speech on campus. So just like using your voice, the same way that, free speech is about using your voice. Use your voice to also defend free speech itself, and free speech and due process too, right? Like, fight for those values on campus, and be attuned to any incident whenever an incident occurs on campus where you feel like someone's free speech rights that might be guaranteed to them by Northwood policy, you feel they're being violated, stand up and defend that person. Again, like, public pressure can do a lot, right? So if you have a lot of people standing up and defending someone, you don't have to defend the speech, right? It's not about defending what they said. It's about defending their right to say it. But if everyone just stays quiet, then it's easy, right, for the administration to just punish this person without any pushback. It's the same, we always say too that professors should do the same thing, especially if you're a tenured professor, and which means that you have pretty good job security. I think that you have a responsibility in that case to stand up for free speech and academic freedom on campus. So I think that that's the number one thing you can do, and get in touch with Fire, because we have a lot of other ways that we can offer help. I think over here. Yeah.
was advocating.
Yeah, I think he's been inconsistent at best. We have criticized, so we've sort of praised and criticized him for different things. You're right, like right, his whole spiel was like, I'm going to bring free speech back to Twitter, and I think he did some good things when he took over the platform. He restored some banned accounts that people who were banned just for the viewpoints that they had expressed. He got rid of a misinformation policy that was pretty bad. But on the other hand, he's done some things that haven't been so great. So I don't know how many people in here are familiar with the Elon Jet scandal. But so there was this account called Elon Jet, and it tracked Elon Musk's jet. But apparently, based on publicly available information, and Elon initially said, like, my commitment to free speech is so strong, I'm even going to let this person who tracks my flights, this account, stay up, even though it presents security risk to me and my family. But then, like, something happened where apparently Elon's son was being like driven around in a car in Los Angeles, and some crazy person like tried to attack him and jumped on the hood. And then Elon had kind of a change of heart about Elon Jet after that, even though there was no evidence that the two things were connected at all. I think Elon Jet just kind of shows there what airport he's going to and leaving. Doesn't show like his real-time location of a car taking his son somewhere. But so that account was banned, and that was one thing. But then what he did that we thought was really bad was he started banning journalists' account just for talking about Elon, like reporting on Elon Jet, or I think in some cases linking to the banned account, which I think was just naked censorship by Elon Musk of people that he didn't like, right? Like journalists who were talking about this, journalists who don't like, particularly have a good relationship with Elon. And I don't think what they were doing like violates any like reasonable policy. You can have a reasonable policy against doxing somebody, or like revealing their private information and like trying to persuade people to like go and cause them harm. But here we were talking about like an account that was already like at this point widely public knowledge and had been deleted. Other people were just basically talking about it, offended for that reason. So I think Elon has a little bit of a problem with resisting censorship when it does come to some speech or people that he doesn't. But we'll see. It's still pretty young in his tenure, so we'll see how things go.
How does FIRE and how do you think about the distinction between public and private colleges? There are private religious schools where, maybe not speech restrictions as much, but they have restrictions on activity based on religious principles, faculty principles. You kind of know what you're getting. You sign a statement of faith, something like that. On the other hand, there's lots of private schools that are secular universities now. How does FIRE think about it? What do they encourage those schools to do? How should we?
Right. So yeah, at public university, of course, they're bound by the First Amendment. So we always advocate for free speech at those universities. At private universities, we look at what their mission and their policies are. So if they have language in their mission or in their policies that talk about some kind of commitment to free speech, some kind of commitment to academic freedom, then we will try to hold them to that commitment. Because then the argument is that you're advertising yourself as this bastion of free thought, which is a good thing because we do think that that's good for higher education. That's what it should be. And then students and faculty are coming to your institution reasonably relying on that, reasonably relying on having the freedom to speak. So if you backtrack on that commitment, then we're going to push back against that. We're going to advocate on behalf of students and faculty at those institutions. Now, you mentioned religious institutions. A lot of them very clearly place their religious commitments above commitment to free speech and academic freedom. And actually, it's not just religious institutions, although they're known to do that. But some secular institutions actually won't make any free speech or academic freedom policy promises either. And at those schools, we won't do direct advocacy on behalf of students and faculty. Because part of it is recognizing that private institutions, they do have their own freedom of association and freedom to define their own missions. And it's also just you don't have much to appeal to. When I write a letter to an institution that's just private, they have their own freedom of association, they have no free speech commitments, they have no First Amendment obligations. You don't really have much to appeal to in terms of an argument. But I would say that, I think as a general matter, we do think the more institutions that make a commitment to free speech and academic freedom, the better, especially in the realm of higher education, because it's such an important value in higher education. If you're purporting to be a truth-seeking institution, right, and you're purporting to be a place where people can discuss a whole range of ideas and different viewpoints. So I think in an ideal world, like every institution would have that kind of commitment, but that's not the world.
The previous speaker, the Jared policy. This, by the way, is a great resource for our students. Any research on environmental issues, energy policy, licensing occupation, so many other issues at the state level, Mackinac Center is there to help you. What I noticed recently is that they have been posting often on right-to-work laws. And this is something that happened a few years ago, and it allowed people in the state of Michigan to practice their occupations, apply for a job, to work, and to voluntarily exchange with customers without the need to support a union, whether to enroll into that union or pay dues. And the concern now is that because one party in Michigan in the recent elections won both the executive branch and the legislative branch majority, and in addition to that, the Supreme Court here in the state of Michigan seems to be leaning in that same direction, that it's possible for a bill to be proposed and to pass even that would eliminate this protection for the rights of the workers. So the question is that a First Amendment violation when people are forced to pay work, and by paying to a labor union that is sponsoring other side?
Let me preface this one just by saying that FIRE doesn't, at least currently, have a position on this issue. It is kind of like the part of the broader issue about whether spending money is speech in certain circumstances. Since our expansion off campus last summer, we've started developing our positions on various off-campus issues like free speech and social media. This isn't one that we've taken out a position on. So I just say that nobody thinks anything I'm saying here is like representative of FIRE's views. But there was a court decision in Janus. It's Janus versus like a labor union, representative of labor unions. And in that case, the court did hold that that there are limits on the ability of public sector employers to force public sector employees to contribute to a union that they're not a member of. So yes, so there is a First Amendment interest there in not being forced to have to contribute money to a union for a public sector employee of which you are not a member. So that's at least the court's view. Again, FIRE doesn't have a view on that, but yeah, but that's at least the current state of the law.
Terr?
being with us tonight. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you. If anyone else, has a question that you want to ask, feel free to just walk up and ask.